Oh, I think we're live. Yeah. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the people who are on time. Thank you for joining us for June jobs and inflation report, but there's way more than that. There's cars, there's graduates for the job market, there is housing, there is a lot of information on whether or not the economy is still in a recession. Joining us, as always, is Dr. Reilly White, Associate Dean and Professor of Finance at the University of New Mexico. He is very qualified to talk about all of these subjects, and he and I are very happy to read your questions or comments in the chat. So please, please, please drop any questions or comments in the chat. We will definitely read them. As always, this will be recorded and will be put on YouTube within 7 days. So don't be worried if you miss anything. And with that, to Dr. White.
Oh, thank you for the introduction, Colin. Thank you, Albert's List. It's such a pleasure to be here, and I'm so glad to see you all here on this magnificent Thursday evening. In your car, at home, at work, toiling in the mines, wherever you might be. I'm so happy that you are here. Please, as Colin pointed out, ask me all the questions, any of the questions, any of the inputs. We have some excellent interactive audience members here that I know pretty well in the last few months, last couple years in some cases. So I'm really thrilled to have you here and ask all the questions. No such thing as a silly question. We'll answer all of it. Never feel intimidated by the nature of all things. Feel free to ask what's comfortable to you. And so looking at this, when we talk about a few things here, going back up here, we've got the first question off the dockets before we enter the presentation. When will Bitcoin hit $100,000? Everybody wants to know this. Speculative assets. We publish a little bit in cryptocurrency, myself and some other authors. We study the economic fund underlying value, looking at things, looking at speculation, the involvement of new asset classes, bubbles, and how they look. So it's going to be tough. What the headwinds against Bitcoin hitting 100,000 is we're not dealing with the time we had after the pandemic where we were flush with $5 trillion of stimulus spending, a lot of money, no places to put it, a lot of interest in things like crypto and other places to put money in. So now people are looking for returns and other things and trying to assess this market. I think like any markets, like betting on things that offer technological promise, it is the conversion of that promise into something that creates a true stream of economic growth. So I don't see it happening anytime soon, but I could be wrong. And the best part is the cool thing about markets that are dominated at least part by speculation is that it's they can be rewarding. I've noticed one of the findings we made in a paper about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago now probably, was that investment into Bitcoin increases when the risk return ratio, in this case, Sharpe ratio, goes above 2. So it's interesting to look at that and see how institutional money follows when the returns are pretty good. Now, what are the odds that OceanGate sued Boeing Carbon Fiber? Should I start buying puts? That's a great question. Although I can't offer you individually tailored financial advice at this time. That is a really interesting thing. Because particularly, and this is in relationship, of course, to the submarine incident that occurred, as well as the carbon fiber issues in this. And so that's a tricky thing. So we can talk about the questions of the utilization of carbon fiber in situations that are, 10,000 feet or more under the ocean. That's a really good question. I think it's something interesting to watch, but I don't know if it will be a huge impact, given that I'm more interested in Boeing's future record on their ability to generate incoming orders for their aircraft in the next few years. We're underage toiling. Oh, the rollback of these labor laws. That's right. Wow, you guys are all right. I said ask questions. You guys are all over the place. I love this. Let's talk about child labor. So that's really interesting. And so this is, I would argue that the child labor question derives from a general sense that a lot of people feel that, oh my goodness, we don't have workers for service sector jobs that we can pay minimum wage for. And some of that is actually due to a few reasons. One of them is not only the fact that we want to fill these roles with children in some cases, but in other aspects is that workers who traditionally perform these roles, especially in the post-2016 era, 2017, we had kind of a clampdown, or at least a perceived clampdown with regard regards to our immigration policy that has not been fully changed. The amount of immigrants that came through in about the 4-year period of 2017 to 2021 was lower. I think it's a fair point to look at what other countries are doing in this space. One example being, and there was some discussion about this in The Economist, some discussion about this in Matt Iglesias's Substack, looking at immigration as a whole and being actually thoughtful and filling holes in our labor force with a situation where you can be strict on the question of illegal immigration, but allow more legal immigrants in and allow clearer pathways for those immigrants to come in. And that can help alleviate some labor shortages. So you don't have to resort in going back to hiring children. So really interesting. So coins are all correlation assets, not hedge, which is their thesis, or tech. End of the world, which is it? Correlation assets, not hedge, their thesis, or tech. That's a really interesting thing. Wow, look at this. You guys are in this. Government's just trying to help this. I'm trying to answer OceanGate. I see this. I'm reading your. Oh, look at this. That's a great discussion. I like this. Oh, the fight about labor laws. So if Boeing, I think in the future, I think the takeaway from the chat window is look to Boeing to perhaps perhaps they relied too much on underage labor to produce carbon fiber used in ocean going submersibles, which is a very small, nuanced market. This is very interesting, and that makes it very hard. I don't know how big the underlying market is, but it's not, I guess it's currently not their present business. Living wage at MIT.edu, very nice. The living wage calculator Scott Nicholson put in is a great source of information, a great source of data. All right, let's rock and roll as we come through here. And if I miss anything, just keep asking the questions and keep posting them in there. And I love this. Keep following up on the Boeing stuff too, especially as that relates to this stuff. And I guess one thing that we can follow when we think about Boeing is when we think about things like stock prices, other things in the marketplace, we're looking at the market is making an anticipation of a future company's profits in the future and how much that money will then come back to shareholders. And so when we look at questions like Boeing, we know it makes a lot of things. There's a lot of defense sector approaches, a lot of commercial airline space. And we know that their stock has been kind of in a languished space, since the beginning of the pandemic, still falling below where it was the 2019 highs that it resulted in. But in the last year, it's done pretty well. It was cruising at $133 a share in October 2022. Now it's back above. Now it's back above 220. Still not at those previous 300 plus levels it was before 2020. So interesting to note. Boeing has a ways to go to even recover its sense of post-pandemic success. But you came here for the jobs report. What about Logitech? Oh man. Man, I can't. It's just like when you ask me about stocks, it's like I got to answer it because I follow it all the time. So anyway, to talk about this a little bit, Logitech's also been a fun ride downhill. They hit 132 back in 2021. Now they're down about 62. Are they going to get out of this? And the situation is what do you think will happen with Logitech, known for all of its Logitech, known for all of its everything. I have I had an old joystick from Logitech, other things, computer peripherals, that kind of stuff in there as well. And operating income is tricky. They've done a lot of things and they've tried to be competitive in a market that's very challenging, and this is really tough. Is this a bad time? Brett asks about to be interviewing for roles at Boeing. I don't know. It seems like they could use some carbon fiber help. So Brett, if that's your specialty, I'd say this is the perfect time to. No, I wouldn't look at it. Remember that the market knows about this already. And the question is what additional discovery will the market make that will surprise investors with regard to Boeing and its perception of these things? And that's what you're betting on when you bet on a stock, is you're looking at, okay, investors know this, what's traded in and known information, because you're discussing this online. This is known, and therefore it should be priced in the market with regards to large stocks. And what the question is what surprises will come down the line based upon this? What are your indications that the market is not correct about Boeing? And so when you make an investment, if you're looking to buy a stock, you have to figure out and say, well, is the market right about this? And you almost have to make a thesis that's counterintuitive to how the market works, because the market combines a whole bunch of buyers and sellers. It evaluates what a fair price of a stock is. And you're going against almost boldly against millions of other investors who argue and say, this is the clearance price, but I bet it's undervalued. And I believe it's undervalued undervalued because of this, or I believe it's overvalued because the market isn't taking into respect the liability issues it has around this line of business. And so that becomes the question. So when you ask questions about stocks like that, always ask yourself the question and say, well, what is my thesis around this stock? Why do I think I know more than the market, or what is my particular insight with regards to this? Last question on a specific stock, or it will never end. We don't want improper financial advice. We can talk about industry. I would teach you how to view stocks and how to view stocks in this sense, but these are the questions you have to ask. Never make a recommendation on here to suggest to you either. This is really interesting. Can it power this? But these are all questions you have to ask. These are good questions. So is carbon fiber a big component of Boeing, and will this have the negative external effect that isn't priced in already? Is Logitech, can it be trusted to power, as Charles points out, mission critical communications on Zoom calls? This is the thing. Do your analysis of the company. Let people know about it. See what you think. This is what we do in our portfolio class with my students. We create an environment where we say, hey, look, what is your case on pitching a stock for our student-run portfolio? And, what do you believe? What's your thesis about this? And then we go into different ways to prove that thesis. So some students say, well, one of the things you can model, there are models out there to look at anticipated growth rates, discounted cash flow models, other things that you basically plug in, and you make a projection on the future profitability of the company and basically say, hey, I think the growth rate's going to be here. The market thinks it's here. I think it's a buy. And that's what you can say. So think about the way you're doing your analysis with regards to the way that you purchase stocks. So again, not any financial advice, just telling you how to think about this when you go through this. And it's very, very helpful. And it's a tool that will help you in your own portfolios, because that's something that's so important. So let's talk a little bit about our jobs report and other shenanigans today. We've got some good news on the horizon. I would even venture to say, in the last 2 years of doing and being an honored part of the Albert's List presentation community, this is one of my most delightful reports I've read recently. Even though it's not fully delightful, I would like to see more sunshine and rainbows, but in this particular case, it's still pretty good. So let's talk a little bit about what that means. So we've got strong payroll data. Household data was a good say. That was the same kind of as last month too. We've seen this process repeat. But the big thing is we've got 209,000 additional jobs. Unemployment fell from 3.7 to 3.6. Not really statistically significant as we care about this. Where were jobs added? Education and health services, and in this case, often health services drives a lot of this. Healthcare has been a continuous boom, and it does well, regardless of the economy doing good or badly, just because of changing demographics in the country, generalized need for healthcare, et cetera, huge money going into this space at this moment. Government, which has been lacking, and I'll talk a little bit about why. Government employment added 60,000 jobs. This beat expectations on a couple of regards. One of the things that we note is that even though we're well ahead where we were pre-pandemic in the country, in the total employment levels, public sector work is still tracking behind. Why is that? It's very hard for public sector work to compete with wages in growth environments with private sector firms. So when you have public sector workers, you have a choice. You've got kind of the golden handcuffs. I've got this job perhaps, and maybe it has a pension, other deals that government work might have, but it also doesn't give you per se, on average, the salary that might meet the market rate. And it's much harder for things like states, federal governments, municipalities to meet the expectations of salary increases that exist in the private sector, and the private sector can adapt to quicker. And so as a consequence, governments are always kind of at a loss, and they always end up with some type of labor shortage, difficulty hiring, not enough people around because of where they hire, the amount of money they pay, all of that other stuff. And so they're still tracking behind. So this is actually a very interesting mark. You can also view the increase in government spending as saying, wait a second, does that mean that people are suddenly a little bit nervous about their jobs and interested in more of the government work than they were before? And maybe they're looking for that safe job before something bad happens. You can make a lot of cases in this, but I think generally speaking, it's quite good. We should all be teachers and government workers based on this jobs report. Albert says, Aaron says, health services, government jobs are 4 million since inflation kicked off in March 2021. I'll go into a little more detail about that. Leisure and hospitality is up 21K. Financial activities, which hasn't really produced a lot of good shenanigans lately, up about 10K. Information sector, the near and dear to the hearts of every Bay Area person. The good news is it's zero. The bad news is it's zero. No change in the last month, which means that the layoffs that we've seen they tapered off on a month-to-month basis. increases. We'll go into that in a little bit, and that is good news overall. However, we haven't seen it spread widely. We've seen a lot of firms in holding patterns. We'll go into what this stuff means. However, we're seeing drops in wholesale trade, transportation, and warehousing, which was built up heavily as the supply chain increased. We've actually have an oversupply. We went from a situation where our supply chains were heavily stressed to a position where they are actually much less stressed now. And I actually have a chart to show you about that. And then retail services also down about 11%. Now, labor force participation, again, fourth straight month at 62.6%. One nice thing to see is that when we look at the labor force participation rate of prime age women, that's actually the highest on record at 77.8%. This is a particularly challenging figure to look at. We'll talk about that in a second, Colin. That's a good question. 77.8% for the prime age, that's working age women between 18 and 54, is the highest it's ever been. And there's been some concerns about that in the last few years. Of course, women, of course, take the burden of hits with regards to things like childcare and other things, which became particularly dear in the COVID recessionary environment. Now it is hopeful, and this is a good sign. This is a sure sign of economic success in the sense that we're looking at increased participation. Labor force participation across the country, that was 62.6. This is below where we were before the COVID-19 pandemic. And what participation rates are is that shows you the amount of workers who are either have a job or are looking for a job within the population. And so if you retire, you're no longer in the labor force, you're not participating. If you drop out of the labor force, if you're a parent and you're taking care of a kid and you're not looking for a job, you're no longer in the labor force. And so participation is tricky because it's also dependent on demographic variables. Overarching, if we look at the last 50 years in the United States, we've seen participation from the 1970s to the year 2000 increase overall in our workforce. And then since then it's dropped. And we had an increase in the 70s, 80s, 90s, more women in the workforce, baby boomers coming through. And then we had people start going off and retiring. Every time there's a recession, starting in 2001, 2008, and then 2020, we have drops in the participation rate and we never recover from it. Some of that's demographic. People get older, they fall off the market. Actually, I'd say in this case, a lot of it is demographic. We just have an older population now. Our population is getting somewhat older. We have more retirees, and baby boomers in particular are forming a bump downward. And so I would not anticipate us seeing a big increase in this number, despite all the factors that we've seen so far. So one thing was the question of, would we see the labor force participation rate bounce back after the 2020 recession? And the answer is probably not. We're still going to be about a couple percent below. Aaron says core services inflation is still 3 times higher, and we need to get back to 2% inflation. You're right. We'll talk about that soon. U6 is still 90% of pre-COVID high, which would bring 10 million more into the workforce and drive labor pricing to a fall, which is key, which is true. Absolutely. Great insight, Aaron, on that. Absolutely true. Average hourly earnings rose 12 cents to 33.58. And those of you who are looking for this, one cool thing about, we're going to talk about inflation after the jobs report. Inflation dropped to 3%. Ta-da, that's a really low rate, lower than we anticipated. A lot of that driven by fuel, et cetera. But that means because inflation is low and because wages are, when we think of real wages takes wage growth and subtracts inflation. For a lot of the last couple of years, that's been negative because we've had inflation levels that are higher than wage growth. Now inflation levels have fallen below wage growth and we have positive real wage growth. Hooray! So at the end of the day, wage growth is now exceeding inflation in a meaningful way. And that is very nice to see. This is really good. Charles has a serious question. Will we start seeing useless jobs be eliminated due to shrinking labor pool? That's a really good question. Those systematic, that's a very good question, Charles, because it relates to people's generalized concerns about AI. It relates to people's generalized concerns about, oh my goodness, is my job, is it going to be lost or something else? Is it going to happen because of my job has become useless because of this? And, we go back in history in this and we look at all these situations about this. And I like to bring up the example of telephone switchboard operators, right? So telephone switchboard operators, they exist. Right? That was a fundamental job of the early telephone industry dating from the 1880s to about the 1920s, where you needed a switchboard operator to connect you to someone else on the other side of the telephone. And in the 1920s and early 1930s, I don't know the right year, a solution became readily available where you can easily and technologically just physically call another human being without an intermediary. However, it took 50 years for the last telephone switchboard operator to be laid off, and I think it was 1982. So think about that differentiation. So you have a new technology that develops that effectively makes the jobs useless. But then in the meantime, you have a labor market that, because labor markets, it's like turning a battleship. You don't see the immediate changes, even as technology develops. When we look at new technologies, new developments, even as you point out, shrinking labor pool and economic response, we find that really the economy as a whole, because of frictions that lie within it, it moves often at the speed of molasses when we look overall in regards to structural changes like that. So I think that you can see this in a very gradual way. I think the next recession we have, and what happens is recessions typically speed up economic situations that might be already playing out. For example, if we have a recession at some point in the future, 1 year from now, 5 years from now, whenever, it's likely that will speed up the labor force changes that we see in the marketplace. So does the reduction of unionization impact the rate of change, though? That's a very interesting question. So two philosophies on this you could look at are, and there's two different ways to look at unionization as it reflects this. Unions have been shown to be proactively positive with regards to keeping wages high. And if we look back, certainly at the earlier post-war era, you have elements of inequality that were less in the economy. However, when we think about structural changes of employment, are unions more effective, and as you point out, are they more or less effective at getting rid of useless jobs? Because you can make the argument that these so-called useless jobs are being kept alive through the perception that those economic needs, et cetera. And there's also another thing that's really important to think about when we talk about elements like this. And I love the discussion that's happening here between Albert and Aaron. And I know some of you don't have access to your chat windows. This is really good, really meaningful conversations between here that are worthwhile to talk about. There's a human cost into this. If you work, let's say you work you're a blue collar worker building typewriters for 30 years, and typewriters obviously have become have phased out of the system. They've become irrelevant. So apart from very small niche audiences and a few screenwriters who are very technical about the type of things they write on. But when you look at that and you think about this, you can say, oh my goodness, let's say you're a person who's been doing that for 30 years. The question becomes, what are the barriers? What are the very human barriers for that person changing jobs? It's easy to say and be like, oh, as an economist, we can just move people into these other sectors. But the person is like, how am I just going to leave what I've known for 20 years or multiple decades and acquire the new skills necessary to be competitive in a very different line of work when I've already been doing this for 25 or 30 years? And the answer is some manner of workforce training that is amenable, but we have partial answers to these questions, not full answers to these questions. And there is a human cost. We can't just say, get a job in the service sector or something. It never works out that clearly. It's never that easy. And certainly from the nature of jobs changes, it often involves a human cost. And so when we look at the gradual change, we look at things that often may not appear as quick as we want them to be, or as quick in general, as technologists or people who are focused in the realm of finance and technology might view things. It also takes into account, in its most optimistic sense, the gradual and very human costs that are playing out here. So things to think about. Sean says, I work in electric utilities. Even with smart meters, you'd think utilities wouldn't need meter readers. While they still exist and are being phased out extremely gradually. May relate to the strong IBEW union to which meter readers belong. That's structural unemployment. That's true too. And you can make an argument that says, hey, this is a friction in the economy that keeps us from growth. Or you can say, well, this is something that we all agree to because it helps insulate the human cost of widespread structural change. That, it's an interesting argument to make. This is really interesting. Yeah, that's true too. Scott brings up a good point about newscasters too. It's very interesting. And there's a lot of interesting discussions, especially in the union space. Here's interesting as well. There are some concerns in this report. It's not all sunshine and rainbows. It is nice to see 200,000 jobs, which is, again, this would be a good jobs report, an average jobs report in a good time. Looking at different experiences across different demographic groups, it has not been even. And for instance, even though we've seen reductions across the board in unemployment rates, we did see Black unemployment rates tick up now for 2 solid months. Looking into greater detail across Economic Policy Institute, other sources, there's not an answer to why this is, but it is something that you can do it. Oh, look at this, Gattaca references. Now people are talking about this. Albert says, philosophically, should we always be focused on growth with populations and birth rates in industrialized nations in decline? I feel like we'll have to reprioritize how we look at this. You're right. Growth has many forms, though. We look at growth in 2 factors. There's population growth, but there's also, productivity growth. And productivity growth, in the absence of population growth, productivity growth becomes really important. How much can people produce? How can they do it? And you can maintain solid economic growth even with a declining population if you maintain productivity growth. But the question is how, and you have to maintain high technology to do so. So aren't useless jobs the opposite of essential jobs? That's really interesting. I feel like I'm a professor and I don't know how to qualify that. Probably useless. Charles says Gattaca, guanine, adenine, dimine. Cytosine, right? Typewriter hipster market. That's really fun. You're really true. Aaron, thank you for identifying a correct note. I anticipated there would be a typewriter wielding mustachioed hipsters, and you did so. Thank you for finding it, Aaron. A+ on finding the hypothetical, which I mentioned actually apparently exists in a mean way. This is great. Productivity growth needs to match growth in wages. Louder, further back. There we go. Productivity growth needs to match growth in wages. And what Albert points out, going back to this, as we look at productivity growth and ways we can measure this, is while we've seen productivity growth expand since the 1970s, using some metrics, labor force wages have not increased in tandem. And that, of course, creates interesting differentiations. And the question then becomes, what are the roles to advocate for workers in these spaces to create those higher wages? And I like that point. Aaron says growth is fundamental. Without growth, we don't build our economic investment returns banking systems. That's true. Growth is needed. But again, many ways to define how growth works and many ways we can create growth. And I think about this, looking outside of the question of population growth, which is still a pathway, actually. One way is to do this, if we think about this, we look at things and we say, there's density and other things. I would like, I'm a big proponent of personally looking at the economic data, which is this high, looking at ways we can increase our population even in the United States. And you say, well, I'm already frustrated driving through traffic in the Bay Area. Why would I want more people? The question is of course, it is though, in a way that you can attract and bring, people into the United States and also provide mechanisms by which people feel comfortable to maintain and, support it in ways to have kids if they choose to or don't choose to. It can be a very beneficial thing in the long run for the economy, and certainly something that you don't need to rely entirely on productivity growth, which can be irregular to produce. What if we create an economy focused on cash flow to all markets? Ooh, Albert's going really down the philosophical pathway, kind of like owning a home that brings in cash flow versus appreciation. A pipe dream? Charles points out productivity grew until the creation of Adobe Flash games. Oh man, there's all kinds of things that ruin my productivity on a day-to-day basis. Flash games. Flash games are, they're still, everyone's got a favorite Flash game. Colin, at what point does growth turn cancerous and least resources? I was looking at how we subsidize farming. That's a really interesting question. So yeah, right. I was looking at how we subsidize farming. Farming is a good point. And when many people critique systems that involve say, like as you point out, things like subsidized farmers or those kind of things. It's a really interesting question. The level of interaction between the government and resource providers or the economy is always a source of great debate. On one hand, you can argue that preserving food security is an important part and hence subsidization of farmers makes sense. On another hand, you can argue that says, well, this is actually ridiculous. And the question ultimately becomes, it's very hard to manage something as labor and machine intensive as farming to respond to international changes in global commodity markets, which are hard to anticipate. So it's very hard to create a workable government structure around this. It's fascinating, but farming subsidies are something that, I just got back from Europe for a couple of weeks, and that is something that is just fundamental to how they operate within the realms. And you create a sense of beautiful countryside, et cetera, but you also have a very subsidized environment. Yeah, that's true. Aaron Reyes points out Robert Gordon, absolutely great person to read too. Scott, Albert, you mentioned that a lower birth rate leads to people holding jobs longer with lower tax bases, installing economic growth, resulting in need for immigration, adding the U.S. workforce, and thus national security concerns. Interesting. That sounds fun too. That sounds, oh, good discussions. Anyway, so we don't have data about why this is, but of course the productivity that we've, or the increase or improvement that we've seen on unemployment rates, going back to the slides, has not been uniform. So going back to this, one thing that we talk about, private employment has gone up. Government employment is still lagging below 2020. However, in the last month, it has caught up a little bit with those 60,000 additional jobs. Now, another thing that we brought up and a question that came up in the last session was, what kind of profiteering are companies doing? Is it possible? Looking at the question of, revenues for firms have been increasing, but is it possible they become less profitable? And so looking at some aggregate data for a large amount of companies, sweeping through here and looking at a few things. One of the things that's been noted recently is that companies are re-leveraging. They're taking on more debt than they were prior. And that's interesting. There was a little break as interest rates increased and companies stopped leveraging a little bit. And now they're kind of upticking a little bit, especially in the last few months. One thing, though, you can follow is on the top right chart, there's a blue category called EBITDA. EBITDA, as we say in finance, is earnings before interest, taxation, depreciation, and amortization. So it takes that net income number and it blows it up a bit to include things like depreciation and amortization, which aren't really like cash expenses flowing out the door. You're recognizing a decrease in the value of something. So EBITDA becomes kind of a really nice, measure of how much income a company is making in a different way. And so in banking, we would use it to determine, if somebody was loan worthy or not, something like that. So looking at EBITDA overall, though, we're looking back in the last few years, looking at the growth rate in it. 2018, 2019 saw strong growth. Then in 2020, we had, of course, the pandemic, $5 trillion of money that went in for spending to stimulate the economy. Companies reaped the profits from that industry. They rehired a lot, and they also benefited heavily by that increase in consumer spending. Since that time, though, EBITDA in aggregate, if we look at the growth rate in EBITDA, has actually dropped a little bit off the face of this. Sean, Charlie Munger says a lot of things. Some of those things are good and some things are not. I know where he's coming from when he calls them BS earnings, but they're better than like net income, which can be manipulated every which way of Sunday. One of the things companies can do is earnings management. We can decide to impress shareholders one way or another by deciding when or not we pay things like payables and when we, collect receivables from our customers. And that can create some manipulation in this. There's a whole stack of literature, especially in tax, around these things. Good. Great. Robert Gordon paper of analysis of growth and innovation. Solid. Albert, are you asking me, what are you expecting from bank stocks as they report tomorrow? This is going to be really interesting, Albert. So Albert asked, this is a really good point to follow. If you're looking at this and you're saying, so company profitability growth is going down a bit. Bank stocks, the interesting part about the bank data that we're going to get for the second quarter is that this incorporated some of the after effects of the March Silicon Valley Bank failures, other things that involved capital requirements with banks. So I'm actually very interested in what those will show. Our lender surveys that have come out, and we talked about that a couple months ago, suggest that banks are pulling back on lending a little bit, but we're looking at the same time, we're looking at saying, hey, companies seem to be re-leveraging. There seems to be demand for more loans. I'm very interested to see if they'll be slashed or not. I will say, though, typically when interest rate environments increase, generally speaking, banks become more profitable. So I don't think we'll end up in a situation where we're looking at a lot of undercapitalized banks suddenly or anything like that. I think we're going to see some banks that are under stress still because of liquidity concerns, because interest rates have gone up so much that depositors are still leaving. And as a consequence, banks have to be crafty about the ways that they issue loans. And so that's going to be really interesting to see. And FF says, yes, maybe we should rethink the goal of unending growth. Will it deplete our environment of natural resources and lead to civilization's demise? A fundamental question, right? Can growth last forever? We can argue, that's a really good question about this, and there are things and ways that we can create these, certainly growth in the absence of exploitation. And that is something that I don't think they're mutually exclusive. A good sense being, if we look at, looking at data, and my guess is this is probably the case for California as well. But here in New Mexico, looking at the city of Albuquerque, we actually use in aggregate less water now than we did back in the early 80s. And some of that was due to intentional, it is a desert city. And so we have we get about 9 inches of rain per year. So technically, it's an arid environment. And, there's been significant improvements in the way that water utilization has occurred. Water usage is still high. And there is a situation of how we create, how we manage that scarcity in the future. And that becomes a thing. But you can do so and still achieve it. But, I think that that's what the interesting part over the last few years about what investors have been asking isn't saying, well, we care about ESG, we care about this, we care about this. And when we have this information coming across in sort of the general sense that there's a lot that needs to be done, but a lot of progress has also simultaneously been made. And I suspect we're going to see more progress too. Charles says, I've noticed that email marketing teams seem to be going hard with promoting 4.2% interest accounts. You're absolutely right. And that's the thing too, is people look at this and now banks have a selection choice and looking at some questions, especially if you're a mid-market bank, which means you're not big enough to exploit some of the economies of scale like the JP Morgans of the world do, with being able to hedge across international borders and do things where you can help, offset and offer potentially higher interest rate accounts. A lot of mid-market or smaller banks have struggled with being able to provide depositors that level of interest, and so banks look, typically when interest rates go up, banks look at that and they pay a little bit of money and to depositors, and then they benefit from the higher interest rates because they can charge loans higher rates and their profit margins typically increase. And so it's a very interesting thing to see. So Aaron says, we hope we get another 100 to 150 basis points more rate hikes over the next year. That'll smash goods and services inflation. It sure would, Aaron. Really interesting. I like the aggression in your rate hikes. That's really fun. We're going to have the race, Fed chair one day that will make make the markets profoundly unhappy. I like that. Albert says, choosing chaos. I know, let's make people miserable. Another question that came up in our last session was, is the return to work mechanisms that's been out there affecting quit rates? Basically, the question is we know a lot of companies out there are saying, it was fun for you to work from home. Now we want you to come back to work, because, we just want to see your face. I don't care if you're effective at working from home. So this is actually a debate I have, and it's totally generational because I'm definitely team work from home flexibility institutionally in my management philosophy, and that's not shared universally. And so we have some concerns about this, and all these other things get discussed. But of course, it does come down to productivity and the ability, and also there is also an inability really for managers to measure productivity of workers. Really, to set reasonable productivity guidelines, deadlines, and also measure them and hold people accountable for them are something that defies most managers' capabilities. So let's think about this. Our quit rates are higher than they were before. And this is actually an interesting question because technically, looking both at aggregate numbers and as a percentage of the workforce, quit rates shot up post-pandemic as we entered into a very strong, improved job market economy. People voluntarily started leaving their jobs. It has been going down for the last year or so, but in the last month, we saw an increase in quit rates. And whether that can be attributed to the question of workers being more selective about what benefits they receive from their companies, for instance, the ability to work from home, I'm certain that is part of it, but I don't know if that's all of it. And it's too early to tell whether we're going to see this as an elevated trend. As you can see, it's been such a recent phenomenon where we saw the quit rates increase and then drop. It looks like it is fundamentally tied to the economic growth we saw post-pandemic. So that's a really good question. And gosh, look at all these great questions you have. The other thing to think about is one of the things we look at, one way to look at this is from the New York Fed survey of consumer expectations. This looks at the probability of losing or leaving a job over the next month. So we can actually tell you the probability of losing a job in general, and also the mean probability of leaving a job voluntarily. And it's usually a good economy when the probability of leaving a job voluntarily exceeds your probability in general of losing a job. And right now, the difference between those two is about as big as it's been. which means that you have a much greater odd of leaving your job voluntarily to find a better position than you do for actually being fired. And so that's actually a very positive enforcement on the marketplace right now. Our company is using return to office to force attrition instead of having to pay severance, says Charles. That's a really interesting question. That's possible. What an interesting note to force and say, if you want to work from, if you want to work from home, you don't belong here. Very interesting. Aaron says that Albert, not at all. We can make sure hundreds of millions of Americans can have price stability, which will reduce housing, credit costs, lower rates, more investment, stable, predictable planning. FF says, great to hear New Mexico has become more water efficient. Hope we can continue to make progress like this. I think clean tech and even restorative technology is our future. I think that's true. And the question is, I think you're going to see it happen in a lot of ways naturally and organically with the nature of how people choose and make decisions economically in the market. But it is something we have to monitor and also look at the tech in there. Aaron says, is that New Hampshire could invest in becoming a rainwater harvesting power partner with Gulf countries, et cetera. Or it says NH. I don't know if NH means New Hampshire. Look at that. You're absolutely right. Wow, look at that. Yeah, New Mexico and California are really bad places to harvest rainwater. Doesn't rain enough. Albert says return to office means the commercial real estate apocalypse is on hold, except for maybe San Francisco, New York. Yes, still apocalyptic in San Francisco, New York, particularly. New Mexico, not New Hampshire. There we go. Thanks, Aaron. Yeah, there we go. I definitely need to. I'm about to say here, we don't. We definitely live in a place. Let's harvest some. It once rained 2 months ago. It was a beautiful moment. It was the best 3 minutes of my year. So labor market outcomes for college graduates. So let's talk a little bit about this. We also had a question that said, is this year better than last year? And this is a really interesting thing because we heard anecdotes last year about, I think it's really good. And articles have come out saying it's really good. Then I actually read those articles and you're actually talking around the question without answering the question, which is really fun. I'm like, that's like, this is the great professor thing to do. So are labor market outcomes better or worse? Well, that depends on how we measure it. We know the market overall right now is very good. We know that over the long run, young people have generally increased enrollment and decreased employment. That's kind of the long-term trajectory, meaning more people are currently in college. It's in the last 40 years. More people are enrolled, and at the same time, employment's kind of gone down a little bit. Younger workers in general consistently have worse labor market outcomes. Unemployment rate for young workers, 16 to 24 years old and workers 25 year plus here. Looking at this, they're usually higher for 16 to 24 for a lot of good reasons. And then obviously your market outcomes for college graduates by major, and this dates from February of this year, are a little bit different. Obviously, I'd like to highlight this because this is really fun. It doesn't matter. They're all over the place. Unemployment rate for your fine arts major, about 12%. Philosophy, 9%. Sociology, 9%. Mass media, 8%, marketing 6%, all the way down. Physics about 6%. It goes down to the lowest ones too. A lot of the engineers have low unemployment rates. So it depends. So the short answer is what I also found out though. One thing we can look at is the growth rate of expected, looking at companies and the number of physical people they hire. That growth rate was high last year. It is lower than that this year. And so one of the things is, well, we had a boisterous sense of well-being and sunshine last year. This has since been a little bit more tempered in this market. Numbers looking for UNM are pretty good. We got a lot of employments across the board, but we're also a really tricky economy to look at. Here in New Mexico, we're a flagship university for our state, but we have only 2 million people spread across 121,000 square miles. So just think about that. So it's really fascinating. Oh, look at this. Plantations rainfall. That's really fun. So what is unemployment for underwater basket weavers? Albert says, it's really interesting because it's such a niche market. We're not graduating nearly as much as we should. Very low, surprisingly. UNM is the UC Berkeley of New Mexico. We're the we're the Cal State Chico of Bernalillo County, New Mexico. I appreciate that. Scott Nicholson says, that's fun. Colin's on here. When Colin appears out of the abyss, he's got some questions. Colin, what's going on?
I'm just, taking a look because obviously it's July right now and some college graduates just graduated and, they're probably after celebrating their graduation, they're going to jump into the college, the job market. Is now a good time? And if they're struggling or they feel like they're struggling, what would you say to them?
That's a really good question. So one of the things to acknowledge is The labor market is not homogenous. Your preferences are not homogenous. And regardless of how the market views you in a given year, one thing I would say is it doesn't evaluate your worth as a human being. Your job doesn't define you as your worth as a human being. And this is one of the challenging things we have with graduates who often have, frustrating roles, and counseling with graduates who have frustrating experiences on the job market. And so one of the things is to work, be persistent, be thorough, think outside of the boxes that you're normally accustomed to, take feedback, solicit feedback, look at every angle that you have, figure out what's happening in the nature, where you feel less confident about your process, where are you messing up individually, self-reflect. I think that every individual has the opportunity, truly, in this sense, to show themselves as marketable and worthy of a job, and not to be discouraged by, in many cases, it comes down to you have inappropriate or rude recruiters, an experience that affords you, that derails you and forces you to lose confidence in your ability to convey your own expertise in something, and to remember that you have skills and your skills are marketable. And even if they're not marketable or available in a particular area, think outside of where that might be. Think of other things. People are often, and I run into this constantly, so focused on very precise outcomes and looking at things. I want this job at this sort of place. And it's a journey for people to expand that frontier. But you'll get there, and be encouraged is what I'm saying. Is that you have worth and value, Colin.
Well, I mean, it's not for, I'm not
Colin specifically. I'm just speaking of Colin.
But I appreciate it. I appreciate it.
Yeah, your market worth, we did this thing. How much is Colin worth? $39 at least. This is really fun to secure. Oh, are you dropping some Albuquerque? Look at this. That's absolutely right. Leadership needed to secure New Mexico's economic future. I hear that. I get interviewed by the Albuquerque Journal a lot, but that's really fun that there's somebody who wrote this. That's really cool. Crown Point. That's fun. Thanks for looking at my local paper, Aaron. That's great. Digging up the articles. FF says, FF was talking to Aaron. At Aaron, cool, thanks. A pair of research at the University of Hohenheim has found evidence that suggests planting forests in desert areas can lead to an increase in local rainfall. That's actually true. One of the things, actually, incidentally, FF, one of the things, back when I lived in Massachusetts, I was a nerd of all things. I love data of all kinds. And so I was tracking the average rainfall in New England. And, about 100 years ago, New England was mostly deforested. Since then, if we actually track rainfall records, you've seen an increase in rainfall to the tune of like 10 inches per year in parts of New England over the last year. I suspect that some of that is due to reforestation. New Mexico is a great opportunity for tech growth. I agree. And the hard about is making that happen. I appreciate that, Aaron. Thank you for thinking about us. This is good. Come down here, start a tech company. CRE has many tech segments, office space. That's absolutely true. New Mexico's Los Alamos, among other things, government, tech, aerospace. Sandia Labs are after the Sandia Mountains. I know you've got a little slice in Livermore. Aaron, true, but you could have more semiconductor growth given Arizona growth. And this is true. This is a debate we have constantly. I'm going to be on another podcast for a group of a podcast that's going to happen at the end of the month for another group locally, and they're going to ask a lot of development questions around that. And it's hard. We have a lot of things that we need to do, and we have a lot of philosophies around this, but we suffer from a lot of the same things that exist in other places, and it's just a thing. So let's talk about this. So we talk about this. I hear this often. People are like, "Are we in a recession or not?" And I would actually argue that when I do because it's not based on efficacy or things. People just ask me, like, Reilly's available. We'll ask him questions on the media. Almost every time I get in front of a reporter or something else, they're like, "So, are we in a recession?" And I'm like, "No, this is not a thing. We're not." And it's always the same response. But I hear this is the really, really interesting thing about that. 47% of adults believe that we are currently in a recession. That is an amazingly high number. Reflectively, 29% no, and 24% say that we're not sure. So think about that for a second, right? 47% say that we're in a recession. So are we, we're in a recession. So if I look at indicators that we use to determine whether or not we're in a recession, and we look at NBER saying, wait a second, it's a significant decline in economic activity spread through the economy that lasts more than a few months. Show me where it is, because it's not here. Non-farm payrolls up. This is since 2021, of course. You're dealing with a recovery period following a recession, so it's distorted a little bit. It's not like, oh, the economy's great, but it's also coming from a nadir of economic growth. Consumption is up, employment is up, real GDP is up, industrial production is up, real GDO, average of GDP and GDI is up, real personal income and transfers is up, real manufacturing and trade sales are down, but that does not mean we're in a recession. And that's the really interesting part. Oh, Aaron says, I'll move to New Mexico. I need to hijack you and your PhD homies on our board to rid our New Mexico tech empire. Done. $1 billion for new support. Make it happen, Aaron. Make it happen. Albert says the NBR report's about to come out for Q2. I believe that'll be very interesting to see. I'll keep an eye on that too. Manufacturing and trade sales look like it's starting a recession. And this is the other thing. And I also want you to point out that sometimes it is perfectly reasonable for you to feel that, you know, in your own economic environment, that it's in a recession. Like if you're in the typewriter industry, you've been in a recession for a long time. There's recessions are a overview of the entire economic picture and the nature of where we're going. And certainly there are aspects, you look at things like healthcare is booming pretty well, but you look at other things like, hey, look at the tech sector, look at certain information stocks, look at other things that are happening around the line, and it feels recessionary. But when we think about the question of a recession, you can argue that, well, you know, in any given time period, we can look at contractions within individual industries as part of a cyclical process, and it can feel like within your industry or your window in your environment, it's a recession, but it's not a recession. So I'll give that much here, which is really interesting. 65% believe in UFOs. That's pretty good. 60% of the time, it works every time, Sean. That's my truth. That's how we rock and roll. That's how we, that's what it's like my classes. 40% of the time you get an A all the time. Aaron says sectors and geographies can be a near recessionary, but overall economy can still have growth. Absolutely right, Aaron. And that's true. And so there's a perspective and optics that you have to factor into this. So I'll bring it across the board here. I want to bring this supply chain metric out here because this is really interesting. So Arbor Data Science has this really neat metric where they use to evaluate, you know, how constricted supply chains are. Albert, B-, good work. So when we look at the Z-score of it, and if you think back to your statistics days, we look at, say, plot everything in a normal distribution, you get a Z-score as, you know, 1 standard deviation above or below offers a certain percentage of time that's likely. We saw a supply chain shock in 2020 to 2021 that was 3 standard deviations beyond what we would expect to see. Positive numbers are bad, negative numbers are good, but that has since eased. And not only has the supply chain shock completely eased across the economy, but for most things, not everything, inflation expectations are still floating a little high, and that's part of the metrics, but we are actually almost 1 Z-score below a supply chain constraint. And so we are actually in a position where the metrics that monitor supply chains suggest that, hey, not only have we corrected the supply chain issues, we've actually done better than this. And that's fantastic. So on other news, hourly earnings, and we talked about this as well, real hourly earnings, which have been negative from the 2021 period to 2023, are now 1.2%. Yay, 1% real earnings growth. That feels great. What a time to be alive. Anyway, inflation report, 3%, the lowest since March 2021. So when we looked at this number, why did inflation go down, and why did it go down more than expected? Well, we knew that it was going to go down in the next few months. We talked about this a few months ago because we knew that all that shelter increase we saw last year was going to, because it started leveling out, was going to gradually, just because of math and because inflation's a 12-month trailing thing, fall off of the inflation measures, and it has. And so we lost a lot of that. Rents still make up about 70% of the inflation growth we've seen. Shelter. Notable increases across the board in the last year. Motor vehicle insurance up 17%. Recreation 4%. Household furnishings 3%. New vehicles about 4%. Even though, and the interesting thing is, looking at this as well, if we dominate this, and I'll blow up this chart here, this is a Joe Politano chart, which I like a lot because it shows you how it's spread across. Right now, we've seen decreases in energy. Energy has been a drag on the inflation level instead of increasing it, which has been to our favor. And that's been nice to see because energy, of course, was a big positive aspect of inflation, not a big a big positive number input in inflation for a couple years there. That's since fallen off into negative territory, helping inflation fall further. Food has also fallen because energy costs have dropped. Where we are seeing inflation aren't in goods, but in core services. And that's the thing that the Fed is trying to get around. So with regards to the question of what the Fed is going to do, based upon this inflation, you have a lot of things and say, well, maybe the Fed will stop hiking. We had a couple economists come out and say, I think the Fed's done. I think the Fed is still looking ahead potentially in another gain because they're looking really at that yellow line here. And while core services has turned the corner a little bit, and we want to see those numbers down, they want those numbers down steeper. And I think they might see an appetite for that. And so I've thought about this all day. And initially I was of the mindset that said, oh goodness, maybe we'll be in a position where the Fed will ease up on increases. I think it's still likely they still have one or two up their sleeve. And the other thing to note before we take additional questions about this is measuring inflation differently. So we use one of the things we use core CPI. Another thing we use is PCE, another metric of inflation. We look at those two core numbers. They're still tracking above where we are normally, but it's interesting internationally. For instance, the European Central Bank uses something called HICP, and HICP, the way it's done internationally, is a harmonized index of consumer prices. So if we actually calculated that for the United States, our core HICP would actually be much lower than what it appears to be. So when we compare inflation data across countries, it's important to be like, are you measuring the same thing in the same measurement? And so right now we do have now the best headline and core inflation are now lower in the US than every other G7 nation. Ta-da, that's great news. Are lower energy prices a sign of more effective workplace energy saving solutions, Scott? That's a good question. Unfortunately, in this case, it is going to be based off of global economic supply and demand. In this case, we're looking at concern in the markets over sputtering demand in developing economies in particular, that economic growth, as well as the European economic growth. Those will be sources of interest and concern. And because we live in a globalized market for energy, even though the United States represents a large chunk of that consumption, we aren't a dominant chunk. And so when we looked at those prices, we're seeing some fallbacks because it's anticipated that demand will be hit because the economies of many places worldwide are not doing as well. Colin, what's your take?
So I guess my questions are basically, so are we through inflation? Like, are we through the worst of it? You know, has a soft landing been achieved? And of course, does this mean prices will come down?
Great question. So are we done with these shenanigans? Is this it? Can we close chapter 4 of our lives, the inflationary period, and move on to chapter 5, getting that new job through Albert's list? And the hard part is about this is I actually think no. Right now, it's been a wonderful few months because the stars have aligned correctly. Energy prices have dropped, and it's been delightful. I think we're going to see some stickiness and some unevenness ahead, which aren't necessarily causes for concern, but it's true. I think, there are some uncertainties. I like to think we've crossed enough hurdles. I think now, I thought that, I'm impressed at the level of declines we've seen. And as Aaron points out, housing is 35% of CPI, but looking at the growth numbers, where it's coming from and where the growth in inflation has come, it is 70% of that growth that we're actually seeing. And it's fascinating to see how, how markets have responded to this and how consumers have responded to this. But there are some concerns up ahead. Obviously, the student loans are coming back online. People will have to pay them again starting in September. That's going to make household budgets a little strict. That will reduce expenditures. That suggests that that will help inflation drop further, but it also presents some questions over the overall economy. I think we're still not out of the woods regarding a recession. And I still think if we have a recession, I'd say absolutely, we're out of the woods for inflation, but then a recession is likely. We have a lot of doldrums ahead that might come and affect us. This is a wonderful time. This is a great number. And I can't help but as a finance professional to still ask for and look at questions around what could the worst case situations be. So I don't think we've seen the last of it, Colin. And I think it'll be sticky. I think we'll have some months where it actually rises. And I think it'll be driven by things like fuel, other things. But I think we should see, hopefully, at these rates, a gradual decline in the core service inflation. That is the biggest concern for the Fed right now. That's my hope.
Okay. And will prices go down?
Well, we have deflation.
Well,
If
we
we
have
have a, if we have recession, if we have a recession, that is a possibility to see prices will go down. One of the tricky parts, though, is I bought this little like lamp at IKEA that I just find so amusing. It looks like a little oil lamp, but it's just electric. So I'm going to light that up. So one of these, never spend more than you have to. Rule number one in finance. So when you go to these things and you think about this and you're looking at, is this done? Are we going to see deflationary environment? Deflationary environment, the best, it would be bad for the economy. And that would be an indicative of a recessionary approach. And that's, we want, I mean, that would be avoidable. And that's the really hard part. Because you're looking at this and saying, you know, asset prices are expensive. If rates remain high over the long run, and we'll talk about real estate quickly too on this, but because rates are so high for things like mortgages and because inventories are so low, prices aren't adjusting very quickly for things like real estate. And given the affordability crisis we have in a lot of major US cities, in particular the Bay Area, there's always that question of, are we going to see these prices drop? I mean, they're really high. I think the best case scenario economically is actually to see prices not decline, but grow more slowly in certain respects. And there are ways to manage that, because when you have declines, you create a whole series of other disincentives for investment that can be a negative spiral on the economy. And that is true. As Sean points out, deflation is worse than inflation. As painful as that is, the question is, we have to reach a level where real estate prices in an ideal world, they went up a lot. Can they remain relatively steady? And can we bring incomes up to match them? And can we bring other things up to match them to make things affordable or increase the supply of things? There's a lot of things we can do, but it creates a lot of questions. Yeah, why a 25 basis point rise in July and 50 basis point in September should pound most of the inflation out. We really run the risk of the wage spiral. That's really interesting, Aaron. That's interesting to point out. So though we have wages higher now, do you think the market will be strong enough to sustain that high level of, and this is the thing, as Aaron points out, one of the things to drive inflation over the long run is if wages were really, really high, and above 4% real growth, for instance, would be enough to sort of generate that. That's true. The moment rates go down, it'll be a mad rush into real estate for many. That's true. It'll make a lot of things more affordable. Interesting to see how that plays out, though. Yeah, 2%, Albert. You know, I'm in that boat. Even if I want to move, you can pry my mortgage out of my cold, dead Reilly hands. It's great. Never gonna put my house up for sale. CPI categories across the board. Last year on year, looking at this, motor vehicle maintenance and repairs up. Rents are still up 8%. Going down the list, though, you've seen drops back. We're finally year on year even with things like fish, poultry, meats, and eggs. Gasoline's about 27% cheaper, and fuel oil is about 37% cheaper. Airline fares, although you wouldn't know it in the last few months if you booked your tickets a few months ago, down about 19% year on year. Other things to think about, the Manheim Used Vehicle Index, which shot up because of the dire need for vehicles that couldn't be met in the 2020 COVID pandemic, has dropped about 16% off their all-time highs. That's good. Another thing as well, the Fed Reserve, when we look at the total Fed, what the Fed's doing, they shot up, their balance sheet shot up in value as they instituted the bank lending program, took on a lot more assets, did a lot of borrowing with banks. That's since been alleviated, and they've actually given most of that back, and their balance sheet now is smaller than where it was since September of 2021. Also very interesting. Look at this. Oh, that's fun. Albert says, by the way, tied to the return of student loan debt and cost of consumer goods, have you talked about exploding credit card data yet? That's interesting. Albert brings up a good point. One thing that begs me pause on consumer financing and consumer finance respects is looking ahead at the credit card debt question. Recently, credit card debt has come in the news because we hit all-time highs on our average interest rates for credit cards at about 20.9, 21%, something like that. And people have been taking more money out, more credit card debt out. And that is concerning because credit cards are, of course, a very expensive way of financing yourself. And of course, can result in an untenable fiscal position for many. And it's also a way to look at this and say, are consumers stressed? And the answer is yes. So even though we have a good economy right now, we are seeing some consumer stress. Another thing people have looked at in response to this is when will the excess savings that were built up during the pandemic finally be paid down to a level that is concerning? And people are saying, well, maybe by the end of this year, sometime between in September and December. Very interesting stuff. So real estate, one thing to note, prices shot up, of course. We had the beginning of the pandemic happen. We had very low interest rates at that time. People went into real estate. A lot of people bought homes. A lot of people bought second homes. They had very low mortgage rates. They bottomed out in January 2021 at around 2.65% 30-year mortgage average. Since that time period, mortgages have now topped 7%. Now, because mortgages have gone up in rates, and because people who are in the market right now who own a home typically have interest rates on their mortgages that are much lower, they're holding on to their homes and not offering them for sale. People have ceased moving. And as a consequence, the inventories we've seen in housing have dropped precipitously. The number of home sales has fallen faster in 2020 to 2023, about 42% in 27 months than we've seen in any other period, really. In 2005 to 2010, the drop was greater, but it was slower in comparison. And this is really interesting because when we think about the importance of real estate prices and their dynamics in markets, as prices go up, you want to and as interest rates go up, you expect prices to go down in accordance with this. But again, if your inventory of real estate is so low, there just aren't enough houses for sale. As a consequence, you don't get those adjustments. If you have one house for sale in an entire city, you can command whatever price you want for it because people will still demand it. And so it is supply and demand that's doing this. And until there's incentives, and as was pointed out in these notes here, when we see rates come down eventually, there will be increased interest in real estate in a very meaningful way. But right now, it's causing a lot of issues. This is really interesting. And by the way, the title student loan debt, that's right. Lack of available units in California is also a thing. Sky high rent, home values, people opting to go homeless, even if they have careers. So many people living out of their cars. Aaron says if we have massive residential single-family real estate development, we can saturate local housing markets with inventory, which will put pressure on sellers. I agree, Aaron. Like, that's one thing. I'm all for it. Choo-choo. Let's build out what you can. If I were to boil down my housing policy into a single statement, I'd say basically, if it's a residential land and you can build a safe structure on it, please build it. And if it involves these things, one of the things that's key also in this market is the lack of what we call the middle market for housing. We have a lot of single family homes built around various places. And then you have when people think about, structures, they think of multifamily units, which are dominated by rental housing. There has to be a way for the fiscal security of everyone to buy into housing that also provides that equity ownership that allows them to have greater financial returns and flexibility. And so that's things like townhomes, duplexes, other variations of equity homes that you can create. And that's really important. And so I agree with this. Build, baby, build. Aaron, yeah, you're right. Will there be a supply when there is interest? No, Sean says. Albert says, what are your thoughts about zoning and ADUs, Dr. White? California is about those ADUs. It's all about these ADUs these days, but can't seem to get out of the way on zoning. Oh, I said it right there. I mean, my zoning philosophy is effectively, if I were to sweep it away, one of the things, what was that? Gosh, I've lost the name of it. I got to look it up because I'm going to talk about zoning in my podcast thing in a couple of weeks. But this thing that becomes so important to me, when you think about zoning, we think about this. We recently had a bill passed in Albuquerque that allowed homeowners to build casitas, or those small homes that operate on their properties. They can serve that as rental units or often other things to help alleviate the housing situation. But the city council said no to things like duplexes, other zoning reforms. So. Sorry, Sean's comment's hilarious. I am not a NIMBY, I'm a banana. Build absolutely nothing anywhere near anything. So when it comes down to zoning, as long as the structure is safe to build, I think people should have the ability to build it. And the logic behind that is we have underbuilt consistently, particularly over the last 10 years. We had about 4 million fewer homes built than we had households created in the 10-year period leading up to 2021. That puts pressure upwards on this. And when people think about this, they say, well, and a lot of very interesting people who would normally be aligned in ways. They claim they're free market people, they're libertarian, whatever they are. And they're like, no, I don't want people building homes in my backyard. But I'm like, listen, you have zonings are a form of they're a restriction on the development of real estate to adequately match demand in certain areas. And what happens is if you have a high demand area and you only allow single family homes, the only people who can buy single family homes are incredibly rich. Then you end up in situations like you don't have enough service sector workers, you've got a distorted labor market, you've got a very unhealthy a community space. And the question is, and looking at questions like density, everything else, and all the statewide zoning things, I would, in my way, if I could wave a magic wand, this would be very politically unpopular. I would get rid of most zoning restrictions. Inevitably, you end up with questions about this, and people say, Houston, you'll end up like Houston. Houston has, zoning restrictions. They have minimum lot sizes and they have, minimum parking requirements, which are the two big anathema pieces when you think about housing policy. But at the same level, you can look at a city like Houston and look at a city like Boston and say, which has more de facto segregation, which has more segregation in the way that people live? And the answer is Boston. And the answer is they researched a couple years ago in that article pointed out about 60% of that's due to zoning and that effect of zoning on distorting real estate markets in certain places. And so everybody should get behind, hypothetically, housing, and housing abundance is a very good thing. And I want to point that out. I know it's tricky to say, and there are things like this and housing abundance and looking at this and ways to look at housing and homelessness. And I know, and Governor Newsom, of course, under fire, right? You spent billions on the question of homelessness. And the Economist pointed this out this week. They talked about California and they were like, well, Newsom could do this, but then one critique is, well, what happens if you just actually use the same money you allocated towards some of these programs and housing initiatives and just paid the rent of homeless people? And it's a very interesting question to ask because housing policy really is about the creating abundance and creating opportunities. Yeah, that's right, Albert. That's so that statement is where, yeah, I agree. That's what I've read as well. FF says, interestingly, I took a side gig working for the US Census in California. The number of empty apartments or homes was mind-boggling. I know the percentage of overall housing it was there. That's really interesting too. And so when we think about usage of this, when you think about zoning and usage and building and creating abundance, you can offer some things. There might be policy initiatives across the board. You can say, well, we're going to build, some type of townhome or duplex, but this has to be your only residence. Open it up in an affordable way to homeowners who are single family, or I'm sorry, are first-time buyers, something else like this. There's a lot of ways you can construct housing policy around this. That's interesting, Aaron. Absolutely right. Look at that. These 3 Houston area cities have the highest minority ownership rates. That's true. And I think that this is something when you think about equity and you think about things about way to do this, when you restrict building, and it doesn't have to be bad building. It doesn't have to be sprawl. It doesn't have to be these things. Increase and look at density related questions. And that's fine. And then you have solutions to a lot of municipal problems that people look at and they say, well, we have a bus service nobody uses, or we have something else. You can build density arrangements. It creates more economies of scale across municipal services, also builds the tax base and also creates equity for people. But again, I guess my key point on that, though, at the end of the day, is when you build and consider the development of real estate, do consider things like the way people can generate equity, and don't merely say, oh, I'm going to build multifamily. I'm going to build a multifamily structure, an apartment complex, and charge people at the limit of their money for rents and prevent them from actually building equity that they own and they can maintain. And we have to encourage and build home ownership because it's the single biggest asset most people have, is their home. And it provides all kinds of other positive benefits in this. Yeah. That's true. All these inherited homes sitting around. I don't know why don't I wish I inherited a home. That'd be fun. Use it as a place, rent it out, make it an Albert's List headquarters. So this is also as well, US rental vacancy is approaching the highest in 5 years. After a few years of just 4% levels, rents demand increase. We've actually seen rental vacancy start to go up again. Widespread use. So this is the question. How does the United States fit internationally with regards to housing policy? One good news on real estate is, despite the fact we have high interest rates, we have very few adjustable rate mortgages as a percentage of our overall mortgages, which is not the case in much of the world. The most vulnerable housing markets, places like Canada, Sweden, Australia, Norway, Finland, much more vulnerable because people are exposed to interest rate increases. So you have high household debt as a percentage of disposable income, and then you have a lot of adjustable rate mortgages. And so this is a horrifying time. And I am worried anecdotally, even though our banks are fine and our system is fine right now because of everything we went through in 2008 with regards to certain things. And although I want us to build, the state of banks and the state of the real estate industry in other countries is bad. And this will affect a crash or decline in these markets will adversely affect the global economy in various ways. So that'll be interesting to see how that plays out. Also, as well, bringing it down lastly on the San Francisco Bay Area, as well as our friends down in San Jose. Labor force data, unemployment rates across the board. Looking at San Francisco, we saw unemployment tick up slightly between April and May. Note that they're a month delayed at the regional city level as opposed to the national level. So our most recent data is actually May for the metropolitan area. Unemployment rate's about 3.3% in the Bay Area, and it ticked up slightly. But there are some sources, it's interesting when we look at the data and actually dig into it a little bit. There aren't huge amounts of concern. We saw increases in professional and business services, about 2,000 more jobs there, increases in education and health services that match what the rest of the country is seeing, and about 5,000 extra in leisure and hospitality, which is a good sign that a lot of this market is coming back in California. Government work has also increased as well. So overall, a strong overall approach still, and we see some of that concern about some of those information sector losses spreading to other sectors we have not materialized. Likely in the San Jose, Sunnyvale, etc., dealing with the same thing, looking at unemployment rate ticking up, slightly, but a pretty steady overall situation across the labor force. Health services and education declined a little bit in the San Jose area, even as an increase in San Francisco, but they also saw increases in leisure and hospitality, government work, and some pretty steady rates in manufacturing, and also some nice increases across the board in construction, which is built out separately here, but doesn't appear in the San Francisco report for unknown reasons. Very interesting stuff. Getting higher U.S. property ownership is the key to building great schools as local property taxes, intergenerational wealth. Bam, Aaron, that is the dynamite. That's the secret sauce. Albert says, yep, you want people to have a stake in their neighborhood across the board. And again, think of everything else that happens to you in life. Think of health emergencies, other things. Having equity in something is a savings. And it is, for 2/3 of Americans, it is that own a home. Actually, 2/3 of Americans have home ownership in general, of some capacity of home ownership. Of those Americans, of all Americans who own a home, looking at their net worth, about 2/3 of their net worth is that primary residence. So it is a incredibly a sizable thing, and it is correlated with a great deal of positive effects. Colin says, fun fact, San Francisco is no longer the most expensive area in the USA. It's now San Jose. That's great news. Isn't that lovely? Just shift it somewhere else, Colin. So what do you got? Questions and stuff. That was fun. Let's talk about things. What's going on? What questions do you have? Oh, man. Thank you, those of you who stayed on for a little bit. We have some people here. We got, what's happening? Colin.
Always fun. I mean, I don't have like a specific question, but I guess now is when So are there signs of decline in the Bay yet? Do you think San Francisco is in a doom loop?
I think San Francisco has a lot of fundamental, and when I say let me put it this way, the Bay Area, the city itself has a lot of fundamental issues. Every time I visit, I'm like, this is delightful and terrible. And one of the things is, and to think about it this way, you think about this and you're like, it has affordability concerns. You have profound zoning issues. You have profound, inequities. You've got this huge, doom loop spiral in commercial real estate that's hitting downtown in a big way. And you've got this this structural environment that makes it very challenging. However, on the other side of this, you're looking at this and one thing as the benefit of being an outsider in this discussion is yes to all the things you mentioned. And when you talk to other Bay Area people, you're like, blah, 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 this sucks, no, this sucks. You're in the world here, and you have a very your perception of this is very strong. I would actually argue that the viewpoint that San Francisco is not in a perpetual doom loop because mainly there is a association with entrepreneurship. There is an association with attracting smart people worldwide to the Bay Area still. That is a huge resource. You are still viewed in so many ways as a fundamentally positive force. So I think as long as that exists, you're not Cleveland, you're not Milwaukee, you're not, Detroit, you're not Chattanooga. The Bay Area is different, and it has problems for its own specific concerns, but it's not in a doom loop that's inevitable. I think structural reform, ranging from zoning, abilities, building, a lot of things have to happen though to make it more competitive. It is, the Scranton of California, but also that's the whole Bay Area thing though. So even a success in San Francisco will not necessarily translate into Berkeley being successful, and Oakland, of course, is its own animal. And you have all of these challenges that are fundamental to this. Like in my heart of hearts, like many people, like there's nothing more. I've got family in the Bay Area. There's nothing more than I would love personally to live in the Bay Area. But then there's so many structural issues to keep that from happening. I have a joyously wonderful life, and my income carries a very long way out here. And that calculus has to change to attract other people and to make it a different place. So it's not a doom loop, but it needs a lot of work. That's my bottom line of this. Yeah, that's right. 40%. Most don't know this. 40% of Americans fully own their homes. You're right, Aaron. And that's really interesting. About 1/3 of people, by the way, have been buying homes entirely with cash. And especially in New York City, over half of all real estate transactions that occurred last month were entirely in cash too, which is also very interesting. Albert says, what advice do you have for job seekers? Early in 2023, it was a fear towards a recession, but it's still something to watch. Is the yield curve still inverted? Oh yeah, yield curve still inverted. It predicts a recession. We have a lot of negative economic indicators across the board to suggest that inflation is still likely, but we have very nice economic data right now. Should job seekers be worried? And I think that they should be always cautious about this. It is true that there is still some likelihood of a recession even in the next year. And there's a lot of uncertainties around what happens in Europe. The yield curve can be right for the wrong reasons. And it was negative before the COVID-19 pandemic. And there was no implicit knowledge the yield curve had that we would be in a recession for that reason. And so I'm wary on some respects that the yield curve would be wrong about this. But I will also say that if you're in a job right now, do consider, evaluate your security in that job, your happiness in that job. Look at that mixture of benefits that you have, and also feel free to ask, look around, look at competitive opportunities in other places. But also note that, it does create vulnerability in a time of recession, but you have to live your best life as it stands right now within your ability and capacity to do this. And no job that's terrible and drives you down and makes you miserable is worth it to do for 30 years. And you have a choice. And that's what I'm going to say. Aaron says the Bay Area really needs a massive revitalization program to build a new Bay Area. The port is a joke, which would make the Bay Area a logistics powerhouse. Yeah. Albert says, what economic indicator are you tracking the most in the next month? Great question. Right now, I am actually following up. You dropped it in first. I want to see how those bank stocks did. I'm also following a lot of those corporate financial reports that are coming out. That's my biggest indicator right now of how we're going to do in the future. If companies are showing worse than expected second quarter results, that indicates it says, wait a second, are layoffs down the line? And if layoffs happen, that reduces consumer spending. That's a cycle that could force us in a recession. But if companies are fine and profits are there, maybe they'll hire more. We can maintain this for the long run. Aaron says there should be a new BART infrastructure project to 3 times the BART size. Kill the absurd San Francisco to LA high speed. I'm reading how I think Aaron talks. I don't know how Aaron actually talks, but I'm like, a low speed train for 200 billion, which could fully build a BART train across the whole Bay region. That would be really nice. Are we in an employer's market now? That's a good question. This is still very much an employee's choice. Right now, there's still the ratio between jobs available and jobs that unemployed people is about 1.6, which is still really impressive, but it's down from the 2 that we saw. It's shifting. It's less of an employees market than it was a couple months ago, but it's still very much an employees market. Aaron says BEA personal savings rate. Oh yeah, look at that. That's fun. What's our personal savings rate now? Still rocking and rolling in very low categories, although ticking up slightly between the 4.6% level. Albert says Bart is always looking for more money and no one understands why. One of the mysteries of Bart. Although I really do find their social media account very amusing. Is the great resignation over? Good question. Oh man, Albert, you're asking like all the good questions. This is, you guys are all asking the good questions. Man, is the great, no, I would say that because quit rates are still higher than long-term averages, no, but watch out and see if the resignation will continue in the next few months. That was that interesting thing. We've ticked upward in quit rates. They're a little bit higher. We saw it. We know their resignation is less great now. And it's like the not so great, but also still abnormally high resignation, which has a much less catchy title. We'll see how this plays out in the next few months. Man. Yeah, personal savings is 4.6, which is rocking $1 trillion. Man, I've got some concerns about savings overall. So if we look at Fred's rate, also a fun thing to look at. We look at personal savings in aggregate, could be worse. A good answer, but it could also be better. When we look at the long-term rate, putting that in perspective here, also what Aaron posted. This is a Fred link out to the personal savings rate over the long run at 4.6%. Normally, if we look at, say, the normal times, even in the 2000s, et cetera, it's nice to see things around 5, 6, 7% for savings. Whoa, look at this. Colin with the...
Oh, I only reposted it because you posted it to the hosts and panelists.
Oh my gosh, that's amazing. Thank you. You have so much power. I got to post to everyone. That's great. Sorry, Colin. Cool, guys. What else do you have? Any questions from the audience? Good to see some familiar names out here. Sean, Scott, thank you for coming. Sabrina, Marcia, Aaron. No, any questions? Shenanigans? What else you guys got? Sean, I always like being heckled by you. That's very fun. I like your keep being your things. Never build anything anywhere. Just hold on to this. Join your HOA and like dominate just be president of your local HOA. Just refuse all building requirements. Don't let people change the color on their shutters. We should do an Albert's bar dinner sometime. Aaron, we'll do that. Next time I'm in the Bay Area, let's know. Let's get together and we'll heckle each other about the economic situation. Done. Albert, that's a great question. Is Jerome Powell delusional? That's a really fun thing. This is a fun thing. This is a question. Is Jerome Powell a genius? Is he delusional? Is he a thing? Is he the best Fed chair we've had? Should he be fired immediately? I've heard all manner of things regarding Jerome Powell, which I find very amusing. This is really interesting. That is he delusional, and particularly about the inflation rate. So this is the thing. We've had a lot of, I would say though, in response to that, I follow a lot of other professors in my field, some very well-known ones. Campbell Harvey was making the case 6 months ago that the Fed had gone way too far and was going to send us into a recession anyway. And it was a really interesting case that he made. And this is a dominant force in our field. He's literally the guy who invented, his dissertation was the yield curves are important indicators of recessions. That was his dissertation. He's the guy. Great. He's out of Duke, great economist. And, he came out with this and said they've gone too far on this. Now, the economy has proven more robust than we thought it would. And this is great. And that's an aggregate. And Powell has benefited from this. And it's very curious to think that, I think that what he's looking for logistically is he understands the negative long-term ramifications of inflation, but he also knows that if rates are higher for longer, it will be an effective way to reduce asset prices and deflate a bubble evenly. And I think, so one aspect of a low housing inventory is because those rates, those housing prices adjust more slowly than we would to these higher rates. even though it creates this glut of potential buyers who can't afford to buy a home. It is a way to deflate the real estate bubble we've seen, so to speak, in a manageable way. So I think what's going to happen is the next 6 months to a year will decide the legacy of Jerome Powell in that sense, if this is going to be good or bad, and if he shot too far or not. Because if he's successful, if he becomes the only Fed chair who threaded the needle and brought us a soft landing, it's very hard to argue that he wouldn't be successful. Has the Fed engaged in a pivot, Scott asked, January to March 2023? I would say they have partially pivoted, which is the fact that they stopped their rapid increase, then did what we called in their last session as a watchful pause, where they're saying that we have a couple more increases down the line, but we're going to watch and see what happens with inflation. I think this is the pivot that we've seen. But a pivot, if we look at a pivot as defined as the Fed stopping increasing rates, then yes, or slowing down, then yes. But the other pivot is, what would force them to decline or lower rates? No, we haven't seen that yet. And that's not even, I think, on their short-term picture, barring an economic catastrophe. So I think they're not going to lower rates until something bad happens, like really bad to the economy.
If we see a lowering of rates, would we see a reverse Silicon Valley Bank situation?
Reverse. If we saw a lowering of rates, let me think about. My mind has exploded at that. A reverse Silicon Valley Bank. Oh, what is that like? So
because that happened because no one expected the sudden rate raise, which caused the crunch, right? Well, if we suddenly have a rate lowering, then obviously suddenly a lot of bonds, and then this would directly impact banks, I imagine, but I just don't know.
That's very funny. I don't know. That's interesting. Would we see a reverse Silicon Valley Bank situation? If we lowered rates, how would banks feel about this? That would be interesting. You could see, okay. So let's say that to create that situation, we have to have a lot of banks that are getting behind post-Silicon Valley Bank. They're worried about depositors fleeing. Some banks come across and they've increased their checking account rates drastically to maintain depositors. Meanwhile, the Fed starts lowering rates. They can no longer afford this. They're trapped into some situation where, even though a lot of these are adjustable and they'll just adjust them downwards, their margins now have become squeezed because they're in this situation. You could argue that, but that would be more of a slower unwind, though. It shouldn't be too much of a negative shock in that regards, because they're also going to hopefully see at the same time an increase in loan growth, and an opportunity to make more money on that side. So that's the positive side of this. But more concerningly for them is they have to also watch out on the credit quality side, because if the Fed were to raise lower rates, and it would be a surprise if they did so in the absence of economic downturns, but usually it would be in an economic downturn, and then at which point the bank is more concerned about credit quality and the credit bankruptcy rate that they have, which is also going to be tricky. So Aaron says lower rates would be a disaster. Bond market would implode. The reversion of the yield curve would create a global chaos across currencies and drive inflation. That is true right now. I mean, no, I'm not going to argue. Like right now, right across the board, as much as tempting as it would be to say, let's drop rates in good times, now is not the time to lower rates. It's true. I think right now, it is logical to keep rates higher for longer, even though it's causing pain. And whether or not that involves the Aaron-esque approach of increasing, adding 150 bips to that bottom line Fed rate and making the magic happen, or even leaving it where they are now, I think you'll still see that tendency. That would be really interesting. If we lowered rates, that would be really fascinating. I think there would have bond market effects, but that would be, but again, the only time the Fed, so let's think about that. The Fed lowered rates in 1998 when we weren't in a recession, because though of the global economic situation. We had the Russian ruble crisis and a financial crisis in various parts of East Asia. We had a lot of things happening in 1998 that justified that. And what happened was, when the Fed last did this 25 years ago, lower rates in a non-recessionary environment, that basically just, it benefited the stock market, and potentially some have argued that it encouraged the stock market bubble to be worse than it was, the tech bubble. And it also prolonged the time until we actually did receive a recession. Sean says, I suspect that as rates drop, banks will get looser with credit. Ooh, ceteris paribus. Give Sean more loans. What's it going to be? This is a good question. This is fun. I love more loans. Let's increase Reilly leverage. Sean Reilly leverage. More loans that I never paid back. Oh, this is great. I like this. It'll be fun. I see Sean's ready for this next voyage on his resume. How can I get you? How can I get you a loan? That's pretty good. I think the first Albert's List album should come out based upon that. That's excellent. Yeah, Eurobond crashes. That was really bad. And that's the fun part, though. That was an international financial crisis, Aaron. It was a horrible time. And the Fed was justified in some senses to lower rates because of those reasons. But it was also like, we were fortunate to avoid a recession at that time, which was good. So we have to watch out. The rest of the world right now is, it's interesting. You're seeing some rate increases across the board, across central banks in Europe, other places. China has economic concerns involving a bunch of, we're looking at there's some doldrums, and it might not even be the United States that forces us in a bad situation. Oh man, it sucks to be borrowing money in England these days. It sure does. I was just in England. I just flew back on Tuesday, and that's why I'm so jet lagged. And I feel like I'm low energy, Reilly, today. This is as low energy as I get. And it's been a ride. Japan is starting to rock. UK is a train wreck completely. Wage spiral. It is just, and they're feeling it, and they're totally feeling it. We look at the UK, and it's pointed out uniquely, even among all the other industrialized countries, they still have not recovered from their post-pandemic economy. It still is below where it was prior to the 2020 recession. Fascinating.
Is that due to Brexit?
What's that? I know some of that is some of that is certainly due to Brexit and the economic choices that they made therein. They made some, it is just a fascinating thing. Germany, that's interesting too. I mean, Europe as a whole is, one of the things we've seen is that initially the United States had higher inflation and a worse economic picture. We now have lower inflation than Europe does, and even in the way that they measure inflation, we have lower inflation, and we have a stronger economic growth picture. And is this going to be a long-term thing or not? I mean, I think the Eurozone is always going to operate in a way that is more, they're always a bit more conservative with regards to their monetary policy moves than the United States is, certainly with regards to the introduction of capital as well as the way they manage the system. What concerns me, though, is not only just looking at sort of the Credit Suisse situation, but also the one of the things that distinguishes us, the differences between our continents, our economic regions, is we had a great reckoning with our banks in 2008 that we paid for, and now banks are very well capitalized. And although many banks are well capitalized in Europe, they didn't have that same reckoning. And so a lot of these things, like the real estate market as a whole, is concerning across Europe, and both the adjustable mortgage side as well as other things. I mean, it's just a very unsustainable environment. And it's really just terrible. Bundesbank is notoriously conservative. That's true. I am concerned about the continent with that regard, and they're a significant trading partner of the United States, and that's why we should be concerned. We have both our East Asian trading partners as well as the European trading partners. Japan is doing well, but apart from Japan, it is a challenging economic environment worldwide, and that will have an effect on our ability to grow and maintain our growth. So ideally, you want a situation where everybody is successful, and we can no longer live in a bubble where that's not possible. Man, that was good. Solid stuff. Aaron, I think you're probably right. China's imploding right now. Demographic time bomb, Albert says. This is tricky. We've got a lot of things on the picture. This begs me pause though, right? I mean, remember, the yield curve is inverted, and I keep thinking back to 2019. In 2019, late 2019, the yield curve was inverted. There was no conceptualization of COVID-19 at that time. And yet it happened, and we had a recession. And so it begs the question is, if the yield curve maintains its inversion, what is the yield curve predicting, and why is it predicting it? The magic of finance is, I'm always wondering what natural disaster will befell us that the yield curve will have been proven right about, that even though it maintains, some level. So I am wary in the next year, but I think it's a very strong, but the data right now is good. Cool, guys. Thank you so much. Oh man, I gotta sign off. It's been a delight. I love this Albert's List crowd. I love your questions. It's always a blast when we've got Aaron and Sean together in this room, as well as the Colin Albert expert host list here. I'm grateful always to be a part of this and just to talk to you all and hear your perspectives on stuff.
Feel like we've definitely went past our 90-minute mark. So yeah, let me do our outro. And anybody who has questions lingering can save them for next time. Thank you for joining us. I hope that helped give you a lot of insight and guidance into what is going on in the market, what's going on with inflation, and what to expect in the coming weeks. We do this once a month, and it is recorded and will be put on YouTube within 7 business days. Thank you everyone for joining.